This is GTV. Ride the wind. On December 6, 1992, Squaresoft released the fifth game in the Final Fantasy series. This installment took a few unexpected turns that created a fun, challenging game. Number 5 isn't widely viewed as an epic masterpiece like its other 16-bit brethren, but still holds a special place in the hearts of the hardcore level grinder. Grab a crystal and saddle up your dragon for the story of Final Fantasy V. Final Fantasy V is an unusual game, for many reasons. A game of many quirks that only a special kind of RPG fan can truly appreciate. Perhaps it was destined to be so, as Final Fantasy V began life in an unorthodox way. The game began development before Final Fantasy IV, and was even advertised before the game it was intended to follow. Perhaps behind the scenes, many of the characters and scenarios exist in some sort of ether that later gets arranged and properly numbered. Maybe it's better that stays a mystery. However, it is a fact that Final Fantasy V was first advertised not long after the release of Final Fantasy III. A print ad appeared in the pages of Japanese game magazines in November 1990. Super Final Fantasy, as it was known, told everyone that this would be Squaresoft's first entry for the Super Famicom, set for summer 1991. No tangible information was given, leaving the reader's imagination to dream of what a 16-bit Final Fantasy might be. Final Fantasy IV was originally scheduled for the 8-bit family computer, with Famicom Tsushin magazine explaining a scenario of what this game might be, based on the scant information teased at the time. It has never been made clear how far this game made it through the development process, but sometime afterward, the game was promoted to the Super Famicom, becoming the classic we all know and love, debuting in July 1991. Final Fantasy V dropped the Super prefix and began development alongside Final Fantasy IV. Thanks to the quick release of 4, Squaresoft was able to put in the overtime to develop 5, a time frame which spanned over 2 years, from the first public announcement to the first day of sales. The longest development time ever for a Final Fantasy game, as well as one of the longest of any RPG of that golden era. The core of the Final Fantasy series has always been led by Hironobu Sakaguchi, creator of the series and director or producer for all of the early games. Yoshitaka Amano created the designs of characters and monsters. Nobuo Uematsu composed the score for each game. Within each installment, other key staff would vary. For Final Fantasy V, Yoshinori Kitase joined Sakaguchi in writing the scenarios of the game. Kazuko Shibuya created the sprites and graphical elements. Tetsuya Nomura designed the monsters and enemies based on Amano's artwork. In the early days of the Final Fantasy series, the number system carried a special meaning. Odd numbers were intended to be games that focused on character customization. Even numbers were meant to be story-driven. Looking back at the first 6 games, it's easy to see that 1, 3, and 5 follow a similar formula, where each playable character can have his or her attributes selected and modified to different extents, all based on what the player decides. Final Fantasy II, 4, and 6 feature characters that get stronger over time, but have almost no qualities that can be altered. Over time, this setup has faded away, but must be remembered when invested in a critique of the early days of the series. In the first Final Fantasy, the game begins with the choice of 6 job classes for your 4 playable characters. These jobs get upgraded after presenting the Rat Tail to Bahamut, leading to 12 in all. In Final Fantasy III, these basic jobs were introduced soon after the game began, with more jobs and specific abilities unlocked after obtaining different elemental crystals. Over 20 jobs were available by the game's end, with some having very specific attributes required to complete the game. The plan for Final Fantasy V was to give the player as much control over the game as possible. The jobs that were seen in previous odd-numbered games were refined and streamlined. The end result would lead to a large number of skill combinations. A fighter who can cast black magic, a white mage who can wield the most powerful swords, a monk that can summon Bahamut and also mix up potions? No problem. While job classes were the focus of Final Fantasy V, the game was given an engaging story that, much like other Final Fantasies, hinges upon everyday people called up to save the world. In the Kingdom of Tycoon, the king is investigating the strange behaviors in the wind. Tycoon is entrusted with the wind crystal, keeping the element in balance. With the king away, his daughter, Princess Lena, watches over the kingdom. While on his mission, the king of Tycoon discovers that the wind crystal has been destroyed. As a result, the wind stops moving everywhere around the world. Meanwhile, young Bartz Cares and his chocobo, Boko, witness a meteorite crash to Earth near Tycoon Castle. At the scene, an old man named Galuf Balderson is rescued by Bartz. The old man has amnesia from the impact and remembers nothing that happened before. When Lena tells the two that she is on her way to the Wind Shrine, the three head off there together. The group try to steal a pirate ship that operates independent of the wind. The pirate leader, Ferris, catches them red-handed. Ferris throws Lena, Galuf, and Bartz in the brig, but when it's discovered that Ferris and Lena have identical pendants, the pirate decides to let them go and travel to the Wind Shrine together. Ferris reveals the secret of the ship. It's powered by a peaceful dragon. At the Wind Shrine, the group finds shards of the destroyed crystal, which grant them new powers. The King of Tycoon makes himself visible in the shrine, dubbing the group of 4 as the Light Warriors. The king informs the group of their mission and destiny, to discover and save the remaining 3 crystals, all in order to stop the evil force behind this and restore the balance of peace to the world. While searching for the other crystals, it's learned that those entrusted with those crystals are misusing the powers derived from them by use of amplification machines, created by an ancient civilization. These amplifiers increase the powers of the elemental crystals, which weaken their structure at the same time, eventually causing them to shatter. Through exploration in the game, revelations of Galuf's past are learned as his memory slowly becomes restored. The evil force behind the events of Final Fantasy V is revealed: X-Death. 30 years before the start of the game, Galuf, who is actually from another planet, was one of the 4 Dawn Warriors who banished X-Death with the power of the crystals. If all 4 were to be destroyed, X-Death would be freed and able to exact revenge upon the world. The recent meteorite crashes were attempts to travel between these 2 worlds to stop X-Death. One of these brought Galuf's granddaughter, Krill, to Earth. The family reunion restores the old man's memory. Over time, another part of the story is slowly revealed as the secret comes out that Ferris is actually a girl and that she and Lena are sisters. Ferris, who was born as Sarisa, fell from her father's dragon at a young age, becoming lost, then disguising herself as a boy to join the pirate brigade. The sisters' pendants can connect together to show that the two are related, if Lena and Ferris ever found each other someday. As for Bartz, he too learns more about his family from the past. His father, Dorgan, was one of the Dawn Warriors who fought alongside Galuf years ago. After the final battle, Dorgan married Stella, Bartz's mother, on Earth, where his secret lineage was kept hidden. During the quest, the Light Warriors make friends and join forces, with help from all over the world. Chocobos, werewolves, dragons, Moogles, and don't forget Sid, as well as his grandson, Mid. Eventually, Galuf gives his life for the cause, passing his abilities on to Krill. After all of the elemental crystals are destroyed, X-Death escapes his imprisonment and engulfs the world into the void, while the 4 Light Warriors meet the other Dawn Warriors who tell the story of their world and how years ago the 2 worlds were once one. It all comes to a head when the Light Warriors traverse the void to take on X-Death and save the world. And while all that is going on, Bartz learns to play the piano. Where does he find the time? The gameplay of Final Fantasy V is centered around the job class system that expands over the course of the game, when each elemental crystal is destroyed and those powers are harnessed. Jobs have multiple abilities that are learned in increments, similar to the standard leveling up system. With each battle, ability points, abbreviated as ABP, are earned that unlock different levels of abilities which can be transferred to other jobs later on. At the highest level, the job class is mastered. The flow of the game allows each character to learn new abilities as the game progresses, while mastering them incrementally as new jobs are unlocked. The first job is the Freelancer. Each character enters the game in this default position, a generic fighter. Once an elemental crystal shard is obtained, then the Freelancer can change jobs and begin earning ability points. If you've played the first Final Fantasy, then 7 of these jobs should be very familiar to you. The Knight relies on the use of heavy swords and armor, naturally the best for battles, with a large reserve of hit points and capable of using the strongest weapons in the game. The Knight can also defend ailing party members when somebody's hit points get too low. Mastering the Knight job allows you to equip any sword at any time. The Monk learns super strong attacks that rack up multiple hits at once, and cannot equip many weapons or much armor. It's great for starting out the game with because, unlike the Knight, you can register strong attacks without saving up gil for weapons. A mastered Monk will increase the character's hit points by up to 30%. The Thief isn't a very strong character, using long-range attacks and quick escapes to win battles. One of the skills learned is Mug, which lets the character steal items from an enemy in battle, while the master ability, Artful Dodger, passes on the speed and agility of the Thief to other jobs, which includes the fastest charging active time battle meter. Black mages cast powerful attack spells based on elements, as well as poison, stone, and sleeping spells. Each level of the job unlocks more spells that can be transferred, while the master ability increases magic points by 30%. White mages are not strong in battle, but are great for healing the party and bringing slain party members back to life. These spells are especially helpful when you need to save money for a strong weapon or armor by not having to buy potions or Phoenix Down. Just like the Black Mage, each level adds more spells to the list, including the powerful Holy Attack spell, learned at a very high level. The Master ability increases magic points by 10%. The Red Mage is a combination of the Black and White Mage, with a little bit of Knight thrown in. Very handy in battles where strong attacks are needed, the Red Mage can also cure in and out of battle, and use some of the same spells the Black Mage uses, albeit weaker. This job allows for a mix of black and white magic to be learned. The Master ability, Twin Cast, lets the character cast 2 spells in a row, perfect for when you need to raise a fallen character and then immediately restore all hit points. The Ninja was also a job class from the original Final Fantasy, as the upgraded form of the Thief. In Final Fantasy V, the Ninja works in the same way, using the Thief's weapons and improving on those abilities already learned. The Master ability allows the character to hold 2 weapons for a double attack in battle. There are 3 jobs that match characters from Final Fantasy IV, aka the American Final Fantasy II. The Bard is very similar to Edward. The character can hide during battle and equip harps. The Sing command is similar to a magic spell, in that each one learned has some sort of effect on the party or enemies, increasing in strength as you level up. The Dragoon is close in style to Cain, with the special jump attack that spears enemies from above. Master the job, and you can equip lances at any time. The Summoner is just like Rydia, a type of mage that can call up mythical beasts to do the fighting for the party. The summons learned become more powerful as the game progresses. The Master ability, Call, offers up a random summon without using any magic points. These jobs also appeared in Final Fantasy III, along with the following that are carried over to 5. Geomancers use ground attacks in battle and are also useful in finding traps and pits in dungeons. It takes very little time to master this job. In certain areas of the game, it might even take only a few battles. Rangers are characters that attack from the back row with a bow and arrow. When mastered, powerful attacks from a long distance can be done with ease. Not to mention that being in the back keeps the character safe from damage as well. The remaining jobs were created just for Final Fantasy V. Blue mages can cast powerful spells learned from enemies that have been encountered in battle, as opposed to purchasing them in shops like other types of magic. Blue mages can also wield swords, including some that are above the abilities of a red mage. Time mages use a type of magic that boosts stats of the party or reduce those of enemies in battle, such as haste or stop. The powerful meteor spell is also learned by the Time Mage and allows characters to equip rods at the master level. The Berserker is a job that is continuously under the Berserk spell. They attack without stopping until the battle is won. There are no commands to execute while fighting as a Berserker. The master ability lets the character equip axes. Mystic Knights are similar to the standard knight, though slightly weaker in battle. Their key feature is using swords imbued with magic that can cast spells while attacking. At the master level, Flare and Holy are learned. The Beastmaster job is like a non-magical summoner. Rather than using spells to call for help, Beastmasters catch enemies and then release them for attacks later on. However, the enemies captured need to be reduced to a weakened state rather than defeated. The Dancer can confuse enemies in battle, making monsters attack each other rather than the party. It's only useful in certain situations, but the reward for mastering this job is the ability to equip the Ribbon, which protects the character from instant death and status ailment spells. Samurais are master swordsmen. What separates the samurai from the knight, however, is the skilled use of katanas that can stun or attack a range of enemies at once. The Chemist is a job that improves items used in the game, particularly potions, which double their healing ability. In a way, the Chemist is similar to a white mage, as the commands used can quickly heal up the party, while in battle, the job suffers from a lack of powerful attacks. Lastly is the Mime, a very unusual job. There is only one level needed to master this job, and to do so requires 999 ability points. The job is unlocked after defeating Gogo, who later appears in Final Fantasy VI. The Mimic ability allows the character to repeat the action another party member executed in the most recent round of that battle. This job is found late in the game, after Krill joins the party. As such, no design of Galuf with a mime costume exists in the game's code. With all these jobs and abilities, the player is given more customization options to the party than ever before seen in a Final Fantasy game. Compared to Final Fantasy III, the jobs are more balanced and useful as the game progresses. You don't have to reach level 99 and master each job to finish the game, though that is very fun. With the right combination of jobs and abilities, Final Fantasy V is quite flexible while delivering a classic role-playing experience. Final Fantasy V debuted in Japan on December 6, 1992. The timing of the release put V in a good position. It had been a year and a half since Final Fantasy IV was first sold, ending up selling almost 1.5 million copies, expanding the fan base, who anticipated the next installment. Final Fantasy V was released 2.5 months after rival company Enix's Dragon Quest V, hands down the most anticipated role-playing game of all time. up to that point. Had the two Fives gone head-to-head, there was a very good chance that Final Fantasy V would have been wiped out, sales-wise. Going after Dragon Quest V gave Final Fantasy V a chance to be the next game RPG fans pick up, and if it didn't outsell Dorakue, it wouldn't look so bad compared to being sold earlier, when one could make the argument that customers skipped Final Fantasy to save up money and wait for Dragon Quest. Sales figures for Final Fantasy V were very positive. Approximately 900,000 units were sold on day one. For comparison, Final Fantasy IV sold about 200,000 on day one, while Dragon Quest V sold 1.3 million on its first day. Despite being released in December, Final Fantasy V became the second best-selling Japanese video game of 1992. Across the lifetime of the Super Famicom, Final Fantasy V racked up 2,450,000 units sold when it was all said and done, just short of Dragon Quest V, which sold 2,800,000. Famitsu magazine covered the game in multiple issues in the fall of 1992, first as previews, which gave way to full reviews, with strategy and advice for what to do in certain parts of the game, with maps to several areas in full. Interviews with development staff were also present in a few issues. Final Fantasy V earned a cross-review score of 34 out of 40. The review crew praised the job system and called the story of the game charming, while comparing and contrasting Final Fantasy V to both the older Final Fantasy IV and recently released Dragon Quest V. In the US, news of Final Fantasy V began appearing not long after news would break in Japan. It had been known for 2 years prior to release that Final Fantasy V was coming to the Super Famicom, but for a while, not much else was known. Rumors began to appear in 1992, which led to more in-depth discussion of the game, with screenshots in 1993. The big question in America was, when would this massive new game come out in English? The gaming media speculated that Final Fantasy V would be renumbered to 3 in the US. The game was planned for release in 1994, with Nintendo Power previewing the game that January. It was the closest thing to an official blessing that a game could get in those days. The English translation was handled by Ted Woosley, who had worked on Mystic Quest beforehand. As the translation was being worked on in the United States, Final Fantasy VI began development in Japan. It was decided that 6 would be designated as 3 in America, while 5 would be put off for later, under the working title Final Fantasy Extreme. The change turned the game into a spin-off, somewhat similar to what Mystic Quest was, only with the difficulty turned all the way up, rather than all the way down. In the end, Final Fantasy V never made it to the Super NES in any form. Square USA gave it one more try with a PC version of the game, which also went unreleased. In Japan, Final Fantasy V continued on with a 4-episode OVA series titled Legend of the Crystals. 200 years after the events of Final Fantasy V, the descendants of the Light Warriors find themselves crossing paths to save the world once again. The two heroes, Linali and Pretz, try their best to keep the Wind Crystal out of the hands of both the Tycoon Air Force and Sky Pirates, while searching for the other 3 crystals that have gone missing. The series features all of the trademark elements of the early days of Final Fantasy, with many callbacks to events and characters from 5. These 4 episodes were brought stateside with a complete English voice cast. Despite positive reviews in Japan and the West, Legend of the Crystals has never been reissued after its initial release. The episodes can only be seen on aging VHS cassettes, having never been released on DVD or online in an official manner. As the 16-bit era wound down, the internet began to rise. Through emulation, it was possible to play many games that were left behind in Japan. Some took things one step further, with fan translations of Japanese games appearing online in the late 90s. Among those games was Final Fantasy V, with the first translation made public in 1998. 1998 was also the beginning of a new era for Final Fantasy V. During the development of Final Fantasy VII, Squaresoft had famously, and quite bitterly, divorced itself from Nintendo and aligned itself with Sony. Afterwards, all mainline Final Fantasy games appeared on PlayStation hardware, beginning in 1996, and stayed as such until the Square Enix merger in 2003. One reason behind the change from Nintendo to Sony lies in the PlayStation embracing the CD-ROM format, while Nintendo stubbornly stuck to cartridges. The massive amount of data a CD-ROM could hold allowed Final Fantasy VII to be the game Squaresoft always wanted to make. A secondary upside to CD-ROMs are a low manufacturing cost, where a copy of a new game would roll off the assembly line for less than $1, while cartridges could cost 10 to 20 times as much to make. The low cost allowed Squaresoft to re-release many of its older games on the PlayStation. Final Fantasy V was released in March 1998. The game is mostly the same, but features the inclusion of a dash button for faster on-screen movement, and animated cutscenes at the game's opening and ending. The English translation featured several mistakes and gave Ferris a pirate accent. Some might argue that the fan translation was better than the official one. Eventually, 5 of the first 6 Final Fantasy games were released on the PlayStation, with Final Fantasy VI joining 5 for an American release in 1999, titled Final Fantasy Anthology. Anthology also included a third disc of in-game music as a bonus. Final Fantasy V would be repackaged with 4 in other regions outside the US in 2002, while in Japan, 4, 5, and 6 were all re-released in one special edition in 1999. Prior to the official merger between Square and Enix, plans were already underway to bring many of the 2D Final Fantasy games to the Nintendo Game Boy Advance. Final Fantasy V Advance made many changes, including an improved English script, which fixed many mistakes found in the PlayStation version. The graphics were reworked to fit the constraints of the Game Boy Advance, but were improved upon by adding more colors to some sprites and offering character portraits alongside spoken dialogue. Some changes to gameplay were made, including missable items and events now being made mandatory, as well as a few new job classes and extra dungeons with boss battles. Final Fantasy V Advance was first released in Japan and the US in 2006, with releases elsewhere in the world in 2007. In 2013, Final Fantasy V made its way to iOS and Android. With a touchscreen came a new interface with icons that let the player choose commands. The graphics were also reworked with a high-resolution style that matched Final Fantasy Dimensions. This version, along with the other classic Final Fantasy games, were removed from sale in 2021 to make way for the Pixel Remasters series. These new updated versions of classic Final Fantasy games were rebuilt from the ground up, presented in a style that resembled the good old 16-bit days. The game features a completely reorchestrated soundtrack using live instruments, supervised by Nobuo Uematsu. With so many re-releases over the years, it became difficult to determine which version is official. Final Fantasy V Pixel Remaster, released in November 2021, sets out to be the definitive, final 16-bit version, matching graphics that are close to those seen on the Super Famicom, music that earns the label CD quality, and an English translation that is more serious like the one seen on the Game Boy Advance, while also removing the extra boss battles and dungeons that were never intended to be in the original game, in addition to supporting autosaves and achievements seen in modern games. Will Final Fantasy V ever reinvent itself again? Nobody knows. But if this is the game's final form, then it's a good way to bring things full circle, with a game that retains the original vision Squaresoft had 30 years ago, passed through the prism of modern-day gaming. Looking back on Final Fantasy V, one question stands out as a strong point of debate. Was it right to not release this game in English back in the mid-90s? This is a question I ask a lot, and it seems to be the answer is more often than not the same. Yes, it was a good idea to hold off on Final Fantasy V and release it a few years later. True, it was a bit upsetting to know that way back when there was this lost Final Fantasy game just floating out there. Well, 3 of them actually. But in the end, it all worked out for the best. Final Fantasy IV, the American II, arriving early in the life of the Super NES, gave the user base a long time to discover and enjoy the game. For many, this was the first RPG they had ever played. For some, who had both Final Fantasy I and II, the evolution of gameplay, which, unbeknownst to us, took 4 games, was such a great refinement that a standard had been set. Future games in the series, and in the whole sphere of RPGs, released stateside, would be measured by it. In the past, I have conceded that for these reasons, skipping Final Fantasy II and III was also the right move. Looking back, it feels like Final Fantasy V would have fell short of the mark in the eyes of American audiences. The graphics are not an improvement over the previous game in any way. Back then, graphics were not a huge concern in the RPG realm, but in other series, there were always incremental visual improvements. Other than the funny shock face, there really is nothing that stands out graphically. Sure, the music is as good as ever, but that has never been a letdown. The story of Final Fantasy V, while entertaining, doesn't have the same pull as Final Fantasy IV had. Unlike IV, much of the plot is convoluted and hard to follow, even for early 90s standards. The job class system really stands out against the early and mid-90s role-playing games, as the trend was moving towards more cinematic experiences. That left the player with characters that were pre-configured, only needing to level them up and buy new weapons along the way. You know, the hero is skilled with swords, the strongman is good for winning battles but knows no magic, the black mage has the strongest attacks through spells, but it takes almost the entire game to get there, and the girl is the white mage. Final Fantasy V turns that upside down and lets anyone be anything. I don't know what the reaction would have been. I could see many newcomers not understanding how to use the jobs and abilities early on, faced with game over after game over and just giving up after a while. So instead, the next Final Fantasy game to come down the pike on the American side was Mystic Quest, an entry-level RPG, and then Secret of Mana, which was for a while previewed as Final Fantasy Adventure 2. Then, of course, Final Fantasy VI. I just don't see where 5 would fit in with these games, as well as how you'd have time to play them or the money to buy all of them. The labels misunderstood, black sheep, or underrated could easily be applied to Final Fantasy V at the time, considering how it would have stood next to the rest of the Super NES offerings. Remember that nearly everyone in the industry was skittish about bringing RPGs from Japan back in those days. The games took a lot of time and money to translate, and honestly did not sell well, even though you and I loved them. We all know Mario, Sonic, Street Fighter II, and endless movie-based games brought in the big money, while RPGs that broke even were considered successes. One bad game could have sunk the whole operation, leaving Final Fantasy as a Japanese-only series in the future. So, time moved on, things played out as they did, and in the end, Square left Nintendo for Sony to create Final Fantasy VII, which did finally bring the Japanese turn-based RPG to mainstream fame in the Western world. Okay, it's really active time battle, but you know what I mean. That event led to a few things that helped bring Final Fantasy V to us, and probably just at the right time. The massive fame of Final Fantasy VII gave coattails to the rest of the series and of the genre. For many people, the 7th Final Fantasy was actually their first, raising the question of what the other 6 were. Combine that with the sudden drop in production costs by virtue of the PlayStation using CD-ROMs instead of cartridges. It was easier to take the risk of bringing the game out in English. Now, a large amount of games and history that most never knew about could be delivered to a growing audience. And for the longtime fan, having those wishes from years gone by finally come true. And yes, Final Fantasy V, as a part of Anthology, was hard and difficult, but very enjoyable. However, it was not sold with the mindset of being the latest and greatest sequel, but rather a lost link in the chain, now rebuilt. Without the pressure of being that year's marquee title, Final Fantasy V and other re-releases complemented 7, 8, 9, 10, or whatever the new game was when you first discovered it. A nice way to offer a greater challenge and a nostalgia trip for fans who just can't get enough. And hey, it was only 7 years at the most. Compared to the wait other games took to be brought over, some of which we are still waiting for, that's not so long. Not long at all.